early in South America, I think, but we might have one or two. And I'm delighted today to welcome again Neus Carbonell, who is going to be our commentator, and to welcome Tom Ryan, who is a member of ICLO-NLS, based in another part of the country, not in Dublin, but in Cork, one of the most beautiful places in Ireland, if you ever get a chance to visit. And before we start, I'd like to just remind everybody that after this, we will have two more meetings, to conclude the reading and commentary of this text, but they are not going to be on a weekly basis as it has been up until now. The reason for this is that when we organized the seminar, we had already some dates in our program, in our annual program. So we worked around those dates, and it means that we're going to meet today, then in 2 weeks' time on the 16th, and then again in 2 weeks' time, the last weekend in May. For those of you who haven't seen the information, I invite you with a lot of enthusiasm to two seminars that we're going to have online with Gustavo de Sal on the 22nd and 23rd of May. Two seminars, one more concerned with the formation of the analyst, which is on supervision and the logic of supervision within the Lacanian orientation. And the second one on Saturday 23rd, it's very timely. Would you believe we had actually asked Gustavo to do this seminar many, many months ago, I think probably in October of last year, about the psychoanalysts' relationship to technology and technologies in the plural. So in a very timely manner, we will be able to listen to him on this topic. So an email will be sent around to remind you of these dates beforehand. And remember that you don't need a new code or link. It's always the same link to join us for this seminar. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Tom Ryan. Thank you very much for having very quickly agreed to be part of this seminar. And we're going to get into a reading of part 6.
Okay, so thank you very much, Florencia. So, Civilization and Its Discontents, chapter 6. In none of my previous writings have I had so strong a feeling as now that what I am describing is common knowledge, and that I am using up paper and ink, and in due course, the compositors' and printers' work and material, in order to expound things which are, in fact, self-evident. For that reason, I should be glad to seize the point, if it were to appear, that the recognition of a special, independent, aggressive instinct means an alteration of the psychoanalytic theory of the instincts. We shall see, however, that this is not so, and that it is merely a matter of bringing into sharper focus a turn of thought arrived at long ago, and of following out its consequences. Of all the slowly developed parts of analytic theory, the theory of the instincts is the one that has felt its way the most painfully forward.
Tom,
yes?
Just if you could maybe speak closer to the microphone, because
sure, yeah.
They're telling us that the sound is a little bit low.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll just start that paragraph again, and you can perhaps tell me if this is an improvement, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. We shall see, however, that this is not so, and that it is merely a matter of bringing into sharper focus a turn of thought arrived at long ago and of following out its consequences. Of all the slowly developed parts of analytic theory, the theory of the instincts is the one that has felt its way the most painfully forward. And yet that theory was so indispensable to the whole structure that something had to be put in its place. In what was at first my utter perplexity, I took as my starting point a saying of the poet-philosopher Sheila, that hunger and love are what moves the world. Hunger could be taken to represent the instincts which aim at preserving the individual, while love strives after, and its chief function, favoured in every way by nature, is the preservation of the species. Thus, to begin with, ego instincts and object instincts confronted each other. It was to denote the energy of the latter, and only the latter instincts, that I introduced the term libido. Thus, the antithesis was between the ego instincts and the libidinal instincts of love in its widest sense, which were directed to an object. One of these object instincts, the sadistic instinct, stood out from the rest, it is true, in that its aim was so very far from being loving. Moreover, it was obviously in some respects attached to the ego instincts. It could not hide its close affinity with instincts of mastery which have no libidinal purpose. But these discrepancies were got over. After all, sadism was clearly a part of sexual life, in the activities of which affection could be replaced by cruelty. Neurosis was regarded as the outcome of a struggle between the interest of self-preservation and the demands of the libido, a struggle in which the ego had been victorious, but at the price of severe sufferings and renunciations. Every analyst will admit that even today this view has not the sound of being a long discarded error. Nevertheless, alterations in it became essential as our inquiries advanced from the repressed to the repressing forces, from the object instincts to the ego. The decisive step forward was the introduction of the concept of narcissism. That is to say, the discovery that the ego itself is cathected with libido, that the ego indeed is the libido's original home and remains to some extent its headquarters. This narcissistic libido turns towards objects and thus becomes object libido, and it can change back into narcissistic libido once more. The concept of narcissism made it possible to obtain an analytic understanding of the traumatic neuroses and of many of the affections bordering on the psychoses, as well as of the latter themselves. It was not necessary to give up our interpretation of the transference neuroses as attempts made by the ego to defend itself against sexuality, but the concept of libido was endangered. Since the ego instincts too were libidinal, it seemed for a while inevitable that we should make libido coincide with instinctual energy in general, as Carl Gustav Jung had already advocated earlier. Nevertheless, there still remained in me a kind of conviction, for which I was not as yet able to find reasons, that the instincts could not all be of the same kind. My next step was taken in Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, when the compulsion to repeat and the conservative character of instinctual life first attracted my attention. Starting from speculations on the beginning of life and from biological parallels, I drew the conclusion that, besides the instincts to preserve living substance and to join it into ever larger units, there must exist another contrary instinct seeking to dissolve those units and to bring them back to their primeval inorganic state. And we read the footnote here. Footnote says, the opposition which thus emerges between the ceaseless trend by Eros towards extension and the general conservative nature of the instincts is striking, and it may become the starting point for the study of further problems. That is to say, as well as Eros, there was an instinct of death. The phenomena of life could be explained from the concurrent or mutually opposing actions of these two instincts. It was not easy, however, to demonstrate the activities of this supposed death instinct. Manifestations of Eros were conspicuous and noisy enough. It might be assumed that the death instinct operated silently within the organism towards its dissolution, but that, of course, was no proof. A more fruitful idea was that a portion of the instinct is diverted towards the external world and comes to light as an instinct of aggressiveness and destructiveness. In this way, the instinct itself could be pressed into the service of Eros, in that the organism was destroying some other thing, whether animate or inanimate, instead of destroying itself, its own self. Conversely, any restriction of this aggressiveness directed outwards would be bound to increase the self-destruction, which is, in any case, proceeding. At the same time, one can suspect from this example that the two kinds of instinct seldom, perhaps never, appear in isolation from each other, but are alloyed with each other in varying and very different proportions, and so become unrecognizable to our judgment. In sadism, long since known to us as a component instinct of sexuality, we should have before us a particularly strong alloy of this kind between trends of love and the destructive instinct, while its counterpart, masochism, would be a union between destructiveness directed inwards and sexuality, a union which makes what is otherwise an imperceptible trend into a conspicuous and tangible one. The assumption of the existence of an instinct of death or destruction has met with resistance even in analytic circles. I am aware that there is a frequent inclination rather to ascribe whatever is dangerous and hostile in love to an original bipolarity in its own nature. To begin with, it was only tentatively that I put forward the views I have developed here. But in the course of time, they have gained such a hold upon me that I can no longer think in any other way. To my mind, they are far more serviceable from a theoretical standpoint than any other possible ones. They provide that simplification without either ignoring or doing violence to the facts, for which we strive in scientific work. I know that in sadism and masochism, we have always seen before us manifestations of the destructive instinct directed outwards and inwards, strongly alloyed with erotism. But I can no longer understand how we have overlooked the ubiquity of the non-erotic aggressivity and destructiveness that can have failed to give it and can have failed to give it its due place in our interpretation of life. The desire for destruction, when it is directed inwards, mostly eludes our perception, of course, unless it is tinged with erotism. I remember my own defensive attitude when the idea of an instinct of destruction first emerged in psychoanalytic literature, and how long it took before I became receptive to it. That others should have shown and still show the same attitude of rejection surprises me less. For, as the footnote says, quoting Goethe, little children do not like it when there is talk of the inborn human inclination to badness, to aggressiveness and destructiveness, and so to cruelty as well. God has made them in the image of his own perfection. Nobody wants to be reminded how hard it is to reconcile the undeniable existence of evil, despite the protestations of Christian science, with his all-powerfulness or his all-goodness. The devil would be the best way out as an excuse for God. He would be playing the same part as an agent of economic discharge as the Jew does in the world of the Aryan ideal. But even so, one can hold God responsible for the existence of the devil just as well, for the just as well as for the existence of the wickedness which the devil embodies. In view of these difficulties, each of us will be well advised on some suitable occasion to make a low bow to the deeply moral nature of mankind. It will help us to be generally popular, and much will be forgiven for it. And the footnote says, in Goethe's Mephistopheles, we have a quite exceptionally convincing identification of the principle of evil with the destructive instinct. Denn alles, was entsteht, ist Wert, dass es zugrund geht. So ist dann alles, was Sünd, Zerstörung kurz das Böse nennt, mein eigentliches Element. For all things from the void called forth deserve to be destroyed. Thus, all which you as sin have rated, destruction, out with evil blent, that is my proper element. The devil himself names as his adversary not what is holy and good, but nature's power to create, to multiply life, that is, Eros. Der Luft, dem Wasser, wie der Erden, entwinden tausend Keime sich, im trocknen, feuchten, warmen, kalten, halt ich mir nicht die Flammen vorbehalten, ich hatte nichts apart for mich. From water, earth, and air unfolding, 1,000 germs break forth and grow, in dry and wet and warm and chilly, and had I not the flame reserved, why really, there's nothing special of my own to show. Both passages are from Goethe's Faust, Part 1. Back in the text, the name libido can once more be used to denote the manifestations of the power of Eros in order to distinguish them from the energy of the death instinct. The footnote adds, our present point of view can be roughly expressed in the statement that libido has a share in every instinctual manifestation, but that not everything in that manifestation is libido. It must be confessed that we have much greater difficulty in grasping that instinct. We can only suspect it, as it were, as something in the background behind Eros, and it escapes detection unless its presence is betrayed by its being alloyed with Eros. It is in sadism where the death instinct twists the erotic aim in its own sense, and yet at the same time fully satisfies the erotic urge, that we succeed in obtaining the clearest insight into its nature and its relation to Eros. But even where it emerges without any sexual purpose, in the blindest fury of destructiveness, we cannot fail to recognize that the satisfaction of the instinct is accompanied by an extraordinarily high degree of narcissistic enjoyment, owing to its presenting the ego with the fulfillment of the latter's old wishes for omnipotence. The instinct of destruction, moderated and tamed, and, as it were, inhibited in its aim, must, when it is directed towards objects, provide the ego with the satisfaction of its vital needs and with control over nature. Since the assumption of the existence of the instinct is mainly based on theoretical grounds, we must admit that it is not entirely proof against theoretical objections. But this is how things appear to us now in the present state of our knowledge. Future research and reflection will no doubt bring further light which will decide the matter. In all that follows, I adopt the standpoint, therefore, that the inclination to aggression is an original, self-subsisting, instinctual disposition in man, and I return to my view that it constitutes the greatest impediment to civilization. At one point in the course of this inquiry, I was led to the idea that civilization was a special purpose which mankind undergoes, and I am still under the influence of that idea. I may now add that civilization is a process in the service of Eros, whose purpose is to combine single human individuals, and after that, families, and then races, peoples, and nations into one great unity, the unity of mankind. Why this has to happen, we do not know. The word Eros is precisely this. These collections of men are to be libidinally bound to one another. Necessity alone, the advantages of work in common, will not hold them together. But man's natural aggressive instinct, the hostility of each against all and of all against each, opposes this program of civilization. This aggressive instinct is the derivative and the main representative of the death instinct, which we have found alongside Eros and which shares world dominion with it. And now I think the meaning of the evolution of civilization is no longer obscure to us. It must present the struggle between Eros and death, between the instinct of life and the instinct of destruction, as it works itself out in the human species. This struggle is what all life essentially consists of, and the evolution of civilization may therefore be simply described as the struggle for life of the human species. And the footnote adds, and we may probably add more precisely, a struggle for life in the shape it was bound to assume after a certain event, which still remains to be discovered. And it is this battle of the giants that our nursemaids try to appease with their lullaby about heaven.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom, for that reading, especially the wonderful reading of the poem, Faust. And we have this, I think, is the shortest chapter, which doesn't mean that there isn't a lot in it, but it allows us for more time for questions and discussion and for Neus commentary. So Neus, I give you the floor.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. It is a pleasure to meet you all again. I want to thank again Florencia, Shanahan, the speakers that have preceded me, the commentators that have preceded me, the readers, and also the entire group of ICLO for this wonderful experience that is this collective reading of Freud's master text, Civilization and Its Discontents. Never an activity has seemed to me so appropriate in time and in spirit. The chapter that we have just listened to is devoted to analyzing the destructive force that inhabits human life. We can recall the conditions under which Freud wrote it. That is, at the dawn of a terrible period in history. Nazism was raging, and only a few years later, Europe was to be destroyed by a violent war. Freud asks in this chapter what explanation psychoanalysis can provide for a destructiveness that is in fact very human. He has a name for it, death drive, or as we read in this translation, death instinct. I want to underline that in this chapter, death drive is presented clearly as a fact of civilization. I would like to reread the first paragraph of the chapter we have just heard, and that we are going to comment. I am sure you're aware of it, because it does not seem to me a standard beginning. I read it again. It goes as follows. In none of my previous writings have I had so strong a feeling as now that what I am describing is common knowledge, and that I am using up paper and ink, and in due course the compositors and printers' work and material in other things that are in fact self-evident. For that reason, I should be glad to seize the point if it were to appear that the recognition of a special, independent, aggressive instinct means an alteration of psychoanalytical theory of the instincts. This is the first paragraph. If these lines were coming from any other author, we could think of them as being the classical captatio benevolentiae, fishing for goodwill. But coming from Freud, they have to be taken under a different guise, which comes to me, this is not obvious, this is not obvious. It is Freud's style not to hesitate to manifest doubts about his own claims. It is part of his intellectual honesty. He begins chapter 6 then by alleging that all he can say from a psychoanalytical point of view about aggressiveness, destruction, hate, and love doesn't seem enough, and that the field is open to further developments. I am going to take this statement as a starting point for my reading of this chapter. Freud, who had invented the notion of the death drive, felt at that point, and also at the moment his civilization was in, that the theory of the drives needed further thought to account for the vicissitudes of history. In the first 2 pages, Freud does a detailed analysis of his own progress of what he calls the theory of the drives, theory of the instincts we read in this translation. And Freud takes as a point of departure Schiller's idea that hunger and love are what moves the world. Freud goes over his theory, which is divided between the instinct, between the drive, devoted to preserve the individual, and the instinct or the drive that tend towards the object, that is, towards love, and that aims at the preservation of the species. In fact, we can add, if human nature stayed close to this theory, all could have worked beautifully. But human cruelty exists, as sadism proves. Badness, meanness, is directed towards the object, even the loved object. The first step that Freud takes to resolve what comes to him as an objection to his own theory, this division that I have just stated between those drives destined to the preservation of the individual and those aiming at the preservation of the species. So the first step that Freud takes to resolve what comes to him as an objection is the concept of narcissism that establishes the fact that the libido can fall over the ego as well. In fact, the libido can travel from the object to the ego and back. I want to underline also another statement that we read in this chapter. Freud says, the concept of narcissism made it possible to obtain an analytic understanding of the traumatic neuroses and of many of the affections bordering on the psychosis as well as on the latter themselves. I want to make a point here so that we can appreciate in which way the notion of jouissance clarifies later on some of the obstacles that Freud is encountering here, but also the very notion of the real that will appear much later on with Lacan clarifies precisely what happens or what appears under centered traumatic circumstances that unleash an experience of unbearable jouissance. However, narcissism does not seem to Freud sufficient to account for the theory of the drives. And it is here that his great discovery comes into play, the death drive, which elucidates aggressiveness and destructiveness. Freud confesses here that the obstacles he encountered to defend his concept were major. He states that it is a notion difficult to prove and talks about the resistances to be accepted even by some of his own colleagues. How to demonstrate why a human being can act in order to destroy himself, or why a human being exercises violence beyond the needs for his own protection or survival. Let's pay attention at the way Freud justifies the existence of the death drive, and I quote, starting from speculations on the beginning of life and from biological parallels, I drew the conclusion that besides the instinct to preserve living substance and to join it into even larger units, there must exist another contrary instinct, seeking to dissolve those units and to bring them back to their primal inorganic state. From this quote that I wanted to read again to you, what calls my attention here is the reference to biology. Freud tackles the problem of destructiveness underlying the difficulties of making compatible, the difficulties encountered when one tries to make compatible human life and biology. And it is at this point that something enigmatic appears. This is precisely what Lacan, very early on, in 1948, in a text that I recommend to read along with the Freud text, Civilization and Its Discontents. So a very early on text by Lacan, Aggressiveness in Psychoanalysis. In this text, Lacan highlights the notion of the death drive And he says first that the death drive has an enigmatic signification. These are the words that he uses. And he adds then that the death drive takes as an evidence of the aporia, this is the word, aporia, this great mind, meaning Freud's great mind, of course, encountered in the most profound attempt to date to formulate one of man's experiences in the biological register. So I read again. For Lacan, the death drive as a concept is an aporia, and is the aporia that Freud encountered in the most profound attempt to date to formulate one of man's experiences in the biological register. This point really deserves to be underlined. The theory of the drives, well, sorry, you will find this quote that I just read by Lacan in the Écrits in page 82, if you look for it. So, the theory of the drives, or the instincts, as we read in this translation, was, according to Lacan at this point, an attempt to formulate the intrinsic contradiction that lies at the core of human dealings with biological needs, that is, with life. The notion of the death drive is a major attempt to understand this conflicting relationship between human life and what, if we may call it like this, natural life. When I was rereading this chapter, preparing for today, I remembered this statement by Lacan that I just read, coming from this text, Aggressiveness in Psychoanalysis, because it was a statement that always made an impression on me. And I realized, recalling it, how or why this paragraph is important today, in the present times. Probably because the present world circumstances, the very same circumstances that gather us together through the digital world. So the present world circumstances remind us of the difficulties that humankind has with biology. I want to make as well a special emphasis in this other word that Lacan uses in this quotation I gave, the term aporia. In 1948, for Lacan, there was a contradiction impossible to resolve in the relationship that humankind maintains with biological life. As long as we understand biology as the bio and logi, that is the science of life, or better still, the study of life, but also logi can also mean speech on life. So, under this light, we consider it like that, much later on, with the notion of par l'être, the speaking being, invented by Lacan a couple of decades later at least, this notion reveals itself as a means of resolving this aporia, this contradiction, a notion that allows to unravel this apparent contradiction between human life and life as we know in the natural world. As I will try to demonstrate this briefly, I will go over a little bit more. Well, going back to Freud, for Freud, the existence of sadism and masochism lies at the heart of sexuality, and it is indicative of the drive to destruction that lies at the core of humanness. And it is of primal importance to understand or to interpret life. Both terms, sadism and masochism, testify, says Freud, of the inborn human inclination to badness, to aggressiveness and destructiveness. Freud associates then the death drive with the idea of omnipotence that human beings have in their wish to dominate nature, and it opposes it to civilization. So for Freud, there is an opposition between civilization, culture, no? I think that the word in German carries a meaning that perhaps we've lost a little bit. So there is for Freud an opposition between civilization and death drive. One, civilization, is a force that makes human life possible. And the other, the death drive, is a force that aims at destroying it. But both are inherently human. We can see then why Lacan used the term aporia. The successive destructions that civilization have inflicted upon themselves reveal that in fact the death drive is a force that lies at the heart of civilization itself. In contrast, let's take into consideration that the idea of seeing the human soul as a counterforce to aggressiveness is the aspiration of many forms of humanism. The idea that through speech and reason, destruction, hatred, and cruelty can be won over is the ambition of well-intentioned humanist beliefs. In the same écrit that I just quoted by Lacan, there is a paragraph where we can read, and I quote, "Dialogue in itself seems to involve a renunciation of aggressiveness. Philosophy has always placed its hope in dialogue to make reason triumph." You'll find this quote in page 86. So, what makes psychoanalysis something different from humanism is precisely the discovery of the death drive. This is something that we see Lacan discussing with his colleagues very early on in Seminar 2. I recommend to go and read what Lacan says to his colleagues, defending why Freud was not a humanist, and bases his argument precisely in the discovery of the death drive. So the idea that the death drive lies at the core of the human being undermines any hope of reconciliation with life, which I just mentioned is the ideal of any form of humanism. However, there are, on the other hand, theories that naturalize aggressiveness. I would like to pay attention again to an interpretation that Lacan makes of Darwinism. Very interesting. And it's very relevant as well in our days. For Lacan, the idea of aggressiveness has entered into the morality of our life. That is, one has to be strong, self-asserted, in order to defend himself, to live well, to achieve his own goals. These are ideas that we read in any current manual of self-help. It is enough to take a look at their titles. By the way, I did it yesterday, and it's amazing, the title, the aggressiveness that we read in the titles of manuals of self-help. This was evident for Lacan already, again in the same text, in 1948. And it's even more certain in our days. And Lacan wrote this idea that aggressiveness forms part of the morality of current life. He wrote this idea in The Triumph of Darwinism as a theory that made an alliance with the economy of capitalism and colonization that started in the Victorian England. I want to read you this paragraph because it is really, it's so subtle and so fine. You will find it in the Cree in page 98. It writes, Lacan says, indeed, Darwin's success seems to derive from the fact that he projected the predations of Victorian society and the economic euphoria that sanctioned for that society the social devastation it initiated on a planetary scale, and that he justified its predations with the image of a laissez-faire system in which the strongest predators compete for their natural prey. Cree, page 98. Then violence is clearly an effect of discourse, even if violence can also be found beyond words themselves. There is in this sense a very well-known quote by Lacan that we find in the introduction to the commentary of Jean Hippolyte, and you will find it in page 313. It's a very well-known quote. But I want to pay a little attention to it because it aims at the relationship between words, between language and violence, in a way that probably its reading can be more subtle than it appears at first. In the English translation, this quote is, "Don't we know that where speech gives up is a translation of the French word cédémer, and also means quit, resigns, dismiss. So, don't we know that where speech gives up, the domain of violence begins, and that the violence reigns there already without us even provoking it?" The translation seems to stress the interpretation that violence appears when speech fails. But a close reading of the French text is perhaps a little subtler, and it seems to suggest that there is a knot between speech and violence. If there is a resignation of speech, violence appears. But violence is also the consequence of the speech itself. At least is the consequence of its failing, of its dismissal. Finally, death drive derives its force or its nature from the effects of language itself, from the effect that the word, la parole, inflicts on the being. Lacan makes an enlightening pun in the lesson of the 8th of April of 1975 in the seminar Air as I. He makes a very, as I said, enlightening pun with the word viology with a V, that he describes as la logie de la violence, the logie of violence. In the human being, biology, with a B, becomes viology as a result of the non-sexual rapport. The speaking being has no natural relation with his or her biological needs. Jouissance, as the result of the word over the body, modifies the body itself, preventing the existence of any good, convenient, dual rapport with the object. This is what accounts, this is what allows us to substitute biology, that is the realm of life as the natural realm, for biology, the realm of violence. Therefore, jouissance inflicts a violence on the human world by a mere fact of a structure, because it makes it impossible the reciprocity of jouissances. We can see this as the Lacanian ultimate interpretation of the Freudian death drive. And it is also the most ultimate undermining of any humanist dream. Freud wrote this text at the threshold of the terrible destruction that occurred in the early 40s in Europe, mostly, but not only, during the Second World War. Nowadays, in our world, the modification of nature carried out by science and technology is probably leading civilization as we have known it to what some see as irreversible changes. Whatever caused the corona pandemics, for instance, seems to be perhaps more linked with biology rather than with biology. This is our real, and this is also our civilization and its malaise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neus, for the rigor of your comment. It's suddenly we find ourselves going through with a red thread that you found that allows us to, I would say, nearly illuminate these points that appear quite obscure, even though Freud says at the beginning, what I'm going to expose here is common knowledge. I found that this chapter has very specific points where there is a darkness in, at least in my possibility to understand. And suddenly with your commentary, and especially with what you brought towards the end, this way of using Lacan's trajectory up until the end, up until seminar 22, I'm going to ask you for the precise reference of that because I couldn't catch it. But it's a red thread that allows us to bring some light on this impasses, nature, culture, life, death, narcissism, the object. So in a way, for me, what you did, Neus, is a commentary that demonstrates in act that there where Freud couldn't extract himself or exit the binaries, the binarism of his theory, which was the binarism of his time, you brought the red thread of Lacan's unarism. And it's in a torsion that in a very subtle, delicate way is the torsion of changing a B for a V. and there you extract yourself from the binarism to read our times and our epoch extraordinary way. So thank you very much, Neus. I would like perhaps to ask Linda. First of all, I'm going to ask whether the sound and the technical matters are okay. If one or two people can give us a sign of that. Good. Second, I'm going to ask Linda, who perhaps has already gathered some of the comments and questions. We will open the mic as well for those who want to speak. And we have the function raise hand here in your lower part of your screen. So don't hesitate to raise your hand. Perhaps, Tom, would you like to maybe make a remark or ask Neus a question?
Well, I mean, me, yeah. Just, can you hear me okay there? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just like yourself, I've been left with so much food for thought. You know, what I'm thinking at the moment is that so often in common parlance, there is this binary between what we call speech and violence, if you like. I think Neus's comments for me reinforce the whole idea of the jouissance inextricably involved in speech, and how it's not at all as clear as a binary. It's much more complex than that. And as she says, how jouissance inflicts a violence on the human world. And for me, as I say, I'm still so impressed with her comments. They've certainly had a very good effect on me, and complexified the whole thing in a very yeah. So I think it's been just a wonderful reading of the text, and I've just been glancing at some of the comments, and I'm really looking forward to hearing others expand on their comments. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take one of the first questions that came was by Gustav, and he says it's a question that interests me as well, Neus. He says, why did Freud say that these aggressive instincts are only discernible when they are fused with eros?
Yeah, it's a very good question. What I thought when I was reading it is that eros is, if I translate it to Lacanian frame of thought, eros is a symbolic function, right? And all these drives only have its importance when something of the symbolic has had an effect. And this is it. And I think that we probably need to distinguish this from what would be violence outside of the human world. That is what makes violence in the human world so characteristic.
But effectively, because the question arises whether one can, if one could have an objective look, which is impossible, into the natural world, one couldn't conceptualize what goes on there, neither as eros nor as violence.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, Gustavo is raising his hand very politely from Madrid, but still muted.
Now?
Yes.
Can you listen to me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Okay, good morning. Thank you, Neus, for your brilliant commentary. I would like to take this last question or commentary, the importance for us to distinguish from the clinical point of view, the difference between sadism and masochism, as for example, sexual perversions, from on one side, and on the other, those sadists and masochist demeanors that reveals, let's say, a disentanglement of eros and thanatos. Because I think that there are two ways of violence. A violence that is that belongs to the realm of the mixed then of eros and thanatos, and a violence that is absolutely out of sense. And it's interesting to notice that the Freudian concept of sexuality eventually has, well, relatively been accepted by society in general, whilst the death drive is hardly recognized. Even now, we can say just lately, and thanks to the incorporation of the Lacanian thought into political sciences, this concept of death drive and self-destruction is opening really its way as an undeniable real. And thank you very much for your words.
Thank you, Gustavo. I think it's one of the first things that struck me when this pandemic began and the various responses with Tom, Linda, and Neus before starting, how there is a rush to respond and generate responses from various discourses and nearly every field. And one of the first things that came to me when all this began, and especially the reliance on people's, what was called subject's responsibility, individual responsibility in terms of the confinement and obedience to the measures. Of course, the first thing that came to me was none of these discourses include the death drive. So they don't include the idea that in people there is both self-destructive and let's say the destruction of others impulses that play a part in how people adhere or not to these measures, which I think is one of the things that psychoanalysis can bring in the commentary, the ongoing conversation in civilization. There is,
I want to, if I can, I want to thank Gustavo for his intervention, which I think it's very fine. And I like this, the idea that Gustavo introduced of violence out of sense, because this is, we need to understand this concept, violence out of sense, because of the concept of jouissance, exactly the non-rapport, this relationship that human being has with supposedly would be his own needs, and that is the drive that can lead to this violence out of sense. And I find that this is not quite so appreciated in the concept of death drive. So I thank Gustavo for having underlined that. I think that's an important point.
I'm going to take a a question from Natalie Wolfing, as I'm trying to track back some other questions that were left there. Linda, can you confirm we have on the screen, we have an A. Twardon? I don't know if it's somebody who raised their hands and wanted to speak now.
No, I see a hand up for Asaf Manor.
Okay. So
I don't know why I told him. No.
I'm going to read Natalie's question and then Asaf, and then I'm going to track back Marina's questions as well. So Natalie Wolfing from Berlin, thanks for being there. She says, I'm interested in the articulation of the death drive as silent, perhaps in the melancholic, and the death drive as hate speech, perhaps in the paranoiac.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Perhaps we can say that this silent death drive is directed towards the subject itself, and the hate speech in the paranoia is directed towards the other. Although I remember one conference by Guy Briol that said that behind any melancholic, there is always a paranoid. Mm-hmm. So what is the stature of this silent death drive in the melancholic is to see in each case, because there is a strong hate in the melancholic, and when one listens to a melancholic, one senses that hatred that perhaps is not manifested as in the paranoid, but that is there. In any case, the death drive in the melancholic is also a result of words, a result of a parletre, of a speaking being. So I don't know if I would oppose them. I think I would maybe think of certain nuances that make them different, but I don't see them as totally opposites. Mm-hmm. This is what I could say now.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we can open the mic for Asaf. There.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Tom, Florencia, Neus.
Hello.
Thank you for your wonderful reading and words. And I would like to make a comment regarding the negation you've raised between speech and violence. I would like to enhance it in some way, like to put an argument for it, another argument for it. I think this is this negation is, or distinction is another humanistic belief of enlightenment, that if we can enhance communication, etc., then violence would, in some sense, would be overcome. And I actually have a specific a scientific historic work by an Israeli historian, a professor in Tel Aviv University. I forgot his name now. That he shows that in the early stages of the Soviet Union, in the interrogations of, I don't think it was called the KGB then, I forgot the name, but in the early interrogation of people there, a lot of fantasies, or sadistic fantasies, were raised during the investigation that were not acted on. And only in the later stages, in the 30s and the 40s, that these fantasies were acted on, that the purges and so on that happened in the Soviet Union. So I think it's like this is a specific example how violence was not out of speech or out of discourse, but was actually very much enhanced. That was one point. And the other point that I wanted to indicate regarding what you said about speech and what you said about the biology instead of biology is that I think this pandemic is maybe the first one in history that is a product of scientific discourse. What I mean by this is that in contrast with other pandemics that you would see people falling on the street, or we would say it was après coup, like afterwards, that science would come with its statistical analysis and it would say, okay, this is like in the Spanish flu, whatever, it would say, okay, we had this much infection rate and etc. It was alerted on very early on. So it was the hysteria regarding this pandemic is only a product of discourse. I mean, we don't see the pandemic spreading in the capacities that it was imagined that it could have been.
Thank you, Asaf. Neus?
Yeah, well, first I agree that it's important to see the violence that words can inflict and can unleash as well. This dream that through reason and speech we could overcome violence is something that we need to have very present. And we know, because sometimes we know the power of words in psychoanalysis. That's why we're so careful with what we say, and also with our patients, for instance, right? So psychoanalysis advises us about the power of words and how careful they need to be handled. And so I think that it's something that we need to remember. And about the question of the pandemic, I think when I said that it was an effect of biology, it's because the effect also, it's true what you say about how science has overtook the discourse on this pandemic, but also we cannot separate what's happening from the conditions of our world, from globalization, from perhaps climate change, perhaps how wild animals live with human beings. I mean, there are a lot of things. Has been a modification of the real by science and technology, and probably what's happening is not alien to that. Mm. That's why probably this pandemic is something that we need to read in terms of biology as well, with a lot of caution, with in time, we'll know more in time. But I think that, yeah, we are in something that's very specific to our civilization.
Mm. I take the opportunity to go back to Marina's question, which is actually, if I read correctly, about 4 questions in one, but it does point at the enigma of life. The narcissistic libido turns towards objects and object libido and back. You mentioned it, and I would like your detailed comment on this. The death drive is opposed to life, reminding us of the urgent, and as Lacan and Miller puts it, the urgency. Is this the enigma of life as such? And then, if you wish, could you comment on the lullaby Freud refers to? Is he referring to la langue and the effect on the body? Mm. So you can choose.
The second question about the urgency, could you, because I couldn't quite catch it.
I've lost it. The death drive is opposed to life, reminding us the urgent, as Lacan and Miller put it. I presume Marina is referring to the urgency of life, or the times when Lacan speaks about subjective emergencies, la urgencia subjetiva.
Okay.
Is this the enigma of life as such?
Well, I don't. In fact, I wouldn't know if that is the enigma of life as such. No? The enigma of life as such, I would say, is that one needs desire to stand life as such. One needs to, to have desire to transcend the mere fact of existence.
Mm-hmm.
And what desire is an enigma. So I would say that there is an enigma there, that this to me would be the enigma of life. And going back to the question of the melancholic, we see that precisely what happens in the melancholic is that there is no, the existence is revealed as such, without the desire that would make life worth living. I don't know if this way I can answer you, Marina. And relationship with narcissism, is what Freud says in this chapter, right? That his concept of narcissism is that he finds that there's libido in the ego, and that there's and that in fact is the same libido that is over the ego and that can go on the object, and that it's not so easy to separate the libido that is on the ego, that the libido that goes on the object. And I think that the most clear example of that is love. We can love someone in a way that we love ourselves through the love we have to the other, right? And I think that if we understand love as narcissism, or love as narcissistic love, I think is the best example that there is this this traveling of libido from the ego to the object and back to the ego. So that this transference of libido is not so clear as Freud developed at first, and it tells us something about the difficulties of the human being to relate with the external world. It is, and this is why the human world is not ordered, not even by drives that could be with the object, with the self, and this is why life can become so complicated. I don't know. There was another question.
I think there's also a distinction that I find useful between enigma and mystery.
Yes.
Because effectively, an enigma, eventually, like a riddle, has a resolution. But a mystery, and Lacan was very subtle when he proposes when he tries to locate the phallus precisely as that which ensures a link to life, a link that is livable via desire and etc. That comes from the ancient mysteries and the connection of the phallus to the life as a mystery. But perhaps we can move to, we have questions from Sharon Svili, from Sarah Meehan, and from Renata. So in that order. Sharon? I don't know if your mic...
Well, she didn't, I don't know if she wants her, she didn't put her hand up.
Was there a question from Sharon written?
Yeah. Yes. What enables Freud to arrive at the concept of the death drive? How can you link it to narcissism in today's reading?
Could you say it again, please?
Sure. What enables Freud to arrive at the concept of the death drive? How can you link it to narcissism in today's reading?
It's perhaps what you just developed. No, Neus?
I think so.
Okay. Sarah Meehan?
It's not, the hand wasn't up, it was just in the chat.
Oh, it was, okay. Is the violence death drive inherent to the command to responsibility and self-isolation in the first place? It's linked to the comment that I made about, I think it's very interesting question, Neus, because it goes back to something you mentioned very briefly, which was the violence of self-help, and I really liked that. So the command to self-responsibility and self-isolation in the first place, maybe.
In nowadays.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Is that the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to read what's happening now with this idea, this non-Darwinist idea that Lacan has, that Darwin justifies aggressiveness as a moral way of living, right? The life is for the strongest. And we see that how this has impregnated our life. And it's true that the idea of this, what's happening now we have to be responsible, we have to keep at home, we have to be strong to be part of the ones who win over. There is a whole discourse on the pandemics that is profoundly political. And beyond what is a health problem, we need to be very aware that is a very strong political discourse, and that this very strong political discourse is charged with Darwinism echoes, and therefore with this self-assertion, aggressiveness that goes with it. So yeah, I think that in time we'll need to think about the political of this pandemic.
Yes, and in a way we see this clinically, at least I see this clinically all the time, with people who have been involved in, let's say, therapies or treatments that are based on notions such as improving your self-esteem, standing up for yourself, etc. The effect of that is destructive, not only of the bonds that could have existed previously and be fragile already, but it's difficult to go back from that, even though that's not entirely new for us, because as you said, Neus, those analysts and psychoanalytic practitioners who rejected Freud's death drive, the notion of the death drive, based their practice in a strengthening of the ego.
Exactly.
And it's interesting to do a little navigation clinically to locate what the effects of that are in each subject. There is one question by Dominique Chauvin, who says, hello, my question is about note 2 on page 122. I also wondered about this, so I'm delighted that the question appeared. When Freud says a certain event which still remains to be discovered, any idea of what event Freud had in mind?
No.
No.
I must, no.
Well, if anybody has a hypothesis or an idea, maybe Gustavo or others, Veronique, I don't know if she's there, Thomas. We give the mic to Renata, who had her hand up. Renata Teixeira da Silva. Hello.
I don't think there's a microphone. It's not appearing. There's a video, but there's no mic. So
Okay.
not possible.
It's not possible.
No.
Okay. Victoria Woolard. Hi, Victoria from Paris. I'd like to hear more about the distinction that Gustavo pointed out and that Neus agreed with, that there are two types of violence, a mix of eros and thanatos, and then another outside sense. Can we flesh this distinction out a bit more? Violence outside sense, is this what occurs when the signifier strikes the body?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in true, we can say that violence is always out of sense, but we can also say that, well, there is a certain violence that can be regulated by the fantasy that someone has, right? And that, in fact, we can say that the fantasy, like the fundamental fantasy, is a way that human beings have probably to regulate its own violence. In fact, Lacan in the text, in Aggressiveness in Psychoanalysis, says that the Oedipus is a way of, in that 1948, he says that the Oedipus is a way of renouncing aggressiveness, is the way that society, or the neurosis, is a solution for aggressiveness. We can go forward and say, and I think that some of the examples that, for instance, Asaf has put forward, or even Gustavo, there are certain violence that are somehow regulated by the fundamental fantasy that the subject may have. Right? But there is always a relationship with jouissance that escapes that regulation, and that would be this nonsensical violence. This is the distinction I would make. I don't know if Gustavo had something else on mind, but this is how I would understand it. This is why there is this nonsensical or random violence that sometimes we see, and it's probably beyond any kind of regulation by the fantasy of the subject.
Yeah, it made me also think of a very good and excellent text by Jacques-Alain Miller called Violent Children.
Exactly.
Which is published in the Lacanian Review in a very fine translation by our very own Joanne Conway and her group of the SIG, that Neus you know very well because you've worked with it. I think Gustavo wants to add something to that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Neus, I think I agree with you. I think that we can say the same thing in other terms, more simple terms even, that there is a jouissance that is channeled and captured through sexuality. It means that has to be filtered by the phallic function, and the other, the leftover of the jouissance that is out of the phallic function, related to violence.
Yes. Gustavo, I was interested in a comment you wrote saying that Darwin, in his autobiography, refused that his theories could be applied.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. He was absolutely explicit and very worried about the way some parts of his theory had been applied. as a way of trying to understand the logic of society. And he refused that absolutely. He was clearly about that.
But he had already said it, you know. And you see, what I find interesting about Lacan is how, when he mentions Darwin, he sees that as a symptom of the Victorian England, as a symptom of the society that was that was at the moment of its birth. And probably, you know, Darwin found that as something that surprised himself then, right? Is that what you say, Gustavo, right?
Yeah.
It's very, very interesting comment. I appreciate it. Thank you, Gustavo.
It's also wonderful news that you brought back that quote from the Écrit about colonization, and for us to think in particular at this juncture in history, the position of what references are going to be used by the English to account for their responses, you know, and okay, I'm just trying to keep track. We have Roger and Thomas Svolos who are going to we're going to allow them the mic. Roger, you there?
I'm here. Can you hear where I am?
Yes.
I just wanted to take my chance to thank everybody, Neus in particular, for the elaboration and also for the way that the discussion has really helped to fine-tune some points. I was struck in particular by Gustavo's initial intervention about the distinction between the two modalities of aggression, in the way that it was taken up by the questions both of Natalie about the silence of the death drive and then by Victoria. Because that distinction that Gustavo made is even more elaborated in his second intervention, between a violence that in Freudian terms would be or an aggressiveness, shall we say, that would be the outcome of a fusion between Eros and Thanatos, and another form of violence or aggression which would be diffused, which would be outside sense. But then we see the bridge, shall we say, between the Freudian terms and the Lacanian terms, where Freud is working with the fusion, the alloy between Eros and Thanatos, as in a funny way humanizing the aggression of the death drive. Maybe we can see the parallel in Lacanian terms, simply the relation between the signifier and jouissance, to the extent that we could ask about the articulation between signifier and jouissance gives us articulated aggression, let's put it this way, and some kind of jouissance outside the signifier would give us the outside meaning that Gustavo referred to, would be, as Natalie read, the silence of the death drive, unarticulated by the signifier, which would also then link up to what Gustavo now said about the mediation, let's say, of jouissance via the phallic signifier, because it's precisely the phallic signifier that would be the operator of some kind of articulated jouissance and a de-phallicized jouissance that would give us that idea, let's say, of the death drive outside meaning. If you'll permit me just to make a leap at that stage, because to the political question, it's a slightly different, but we can see that Neus raised, because we could ask something about, let's say, the neoliberal discourse, to what degree it tends towards, let's say, a diffusion of instincts, to what extent the neoliberal discourse, whatever that might be, the Darwinian heritage, serves to free up the death drive in less and less articulated or less and less manageable forms. And where one of the original forms of the neoliberal discourse would have been the notion of self-interest, knotting the self-interest of each one with the interest of all, we see where we arrive at is some kind of defusing of interest where actually we beyond self-interest, which would be another version of beyond the pleasure principle, these idiots marching for the right to die of the virus. Mm. There we see, it links up with the idea of a right to ignorance. The right to not know is linked up with my right to jouissance, which is linked up with my right of the freedom to die. And which particular discourse are we talking about there, which we could trace from the whole Darwinian notion of the survival of the fittest and the colonial effects of that, because actually what is colonizing the world now is the fittest virus. And it turns out now it's a struggle between the virus and the humanes. And it may well turn out that the virus is actually fitter than us. I'll leave it there for the moment. Excuse me for throwing everything
on a terribly positive note, you leave us, Roger. Thank you. Neus?
No, I want to say perhaps that this quote that I read by Lacan about Darwinism, I like the term he used, depredation. That in the Victorian England started this depredation of the world, and I think that this is what Lacan said in 48. And with the latest Lacan, we can say that jouissance is depredating. Jouissance is the main force of depredation, and I think that can explain how, in fact, there is no limit. It's true that there is this phallic jouissance that regulates something, but that beyond that, jouissance itself as such is unstoppable, is depredating.
Mm-hmm. So. There is also a question that was pending that I just saw from Shirley in Tel Aviv, if I'm correct. In connection to the point about the intrication of eros and the death drive, biology is also V-O-logy, inherent to the life of the speaking being. I think this has to do with the fundamentals of the Freudian theory of representation as grounded in irritation, a wounding of the organism. Would be interested to hear what you have to say about this.
Could you read the question again? It's a complex question.
So, the intrication of eros and the death drive. Biology with V is also V-O-logy. I don't know what that means, but maybe that can be added. Inherent to the life of the speaking being. By the way, Neus, can you give us the date again of that lesson of Seminar 22, please?
Yes, is the April.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see. I have it here. The 8th of April of 1975.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think this has to do with the fundamentals of the Freudian theory of representation as grounded in irritation, a wounding of the organism, una herida del organismo. Would be interested. Yeah.
Well, what Lacan says is that I don't know if this is the wound of the organism, or we can read it like that. But what Lacan says in this lesson is that as an effect of language on the body, that transforms biology, that is life, into biology, that is into violence. I find that particularly strong. I mean, it's a lesson that one needs to work through, And this reference to biology, which it's only a couple of sentences, I find it particularly strong, because to say that by nature there is something that is violent in the human being means that there is the violence that the world exercises on the body. Maybe this is the question of the wound. There is something about the body that is violented, if we can say like that, by language or by the words, and that has no return. And this is the nature, if we may call it like that, of the human being, of the parler, of the speaking being. This is like ending, like saying there is no hope to any idea of reconciliation with life, with humanism, with reciprocity. This is the end. And I find that particularly strong.
There is a question, there is a question now by Renata, who couldn't join with the mic, but I think it's very pertinent to this. I invite also the other participants and commentators to interject with this, including Thomas Svolos, who's also waiting. But Renata says, my question is related to the societal fall of the paternal metaphor. When we see the opposition between subjects' responsibility and politics' lack of responsibility, once politicians strive to maintain economics in denying the gravity of the biology of the virus at the beginning of the pandemic. Bolsonaro, Trump against state governors, and the disregard for human lives as disposable in the face of economics balance.
Yeah, probably there have always existed cynical politicians. What happens is that now is so obvious. Their cynicism is so obvious that it makes it even worse or even stronger. But it's true, they are calculators. I mean, our society, we can say, is not ruled by the name of the father, but by the calculator. And it's a matter of gaining and losing. I mean, how many a human life costs in regards with the economy and the finances. So I think this is also part of our civilization. In fact, the difference, one of the strongest differences between the text that we are reading and our society is precisely in the word civilization itself. You know, up until the Second World War, civilization was somehow ruled, as this question pointed out very well, by a certain idea of the name of the father, even if it was declining, as Freud noted. And in our era, that it's obvious that is not. So probably what we see is not only the cynicism of the politicians, but the fact that, in fact, is the calculator that is ruling the world. And we know that there is a jouissance that cannot be counted, that is unaccountable. And this is what I don't know if these politicians take into account. I like, there is a beautiful reference to the chapter 7 of the Ethics. I think it's in the one of the last chapters, I can't remember now, when Lacan makes a comment on a Greek film, a beautiful film called Never on Sundays. And probably if we have some Greek people here listening to us, they are aware of this film, where there is a scene where they start breaking glasses on the floor, and the counting machine keeps counting the number of glasses that are being broken. And Lacan makes a reference to the jouissance that is countable and the jouissance that is not countable. So we are ruled. It's a scene that deserves to be seen in the film, Never on Sundays, and also this chapter by Lacan on the Seminar 7. But we are ruled by the calculator, but what they seem to forget is that this goal cannot be calculated, and this virus itself cannot be calculated. And this is precisely what we are now dealing with. That's why Florencia, right, before said, there are still a lot of things that we don't know exactly, because we are immersed in what cannot be calculated.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I ask everyone to bear with us for 5 more minutes because I have a couple of announcements to make at the end. Tom, are you there still? We made you wait.
Yes, I am. Thank you.
What's going on? Tom? No.
My mic is muted. Ah, there we go. Okay. I would like to make a few. First, thank you, Tom and Neus, for your reading and commentary, and Florencia and all the discussion. I want to follow up on Gustavo's first comment, Florencia's response to it, and a comment that Neus.
It's impossible, Tom. No, we're going to turn Tom's mic off.
Yeah, I did that.
It's not possible. Perhaps Thomas, if you write it down a little bit here in the chat, we will include it. That was part of the announcements that I wanted to make. We are hoping that we will make the discussions, the chats, the questions, and the recordings available. Arunava is saying that that's not Tom's mic. We'll try once more, but first I will let you know that, as we said at the beginning, we'll meet in 2 weeks' time on the 16th of May with Veronique Voruz as a commentator, and perhaps some of the things that were left today unanswered or mentioned will be sent by email, including that question about self-esteem and other forms of psychotherapies. We'll respond it. Linda, can we try Tom once more to see if he can go in?
Yeah, we can, but there was nobody else's mic on, so it wasn't Asaf's.
Okay, well then, if that's okay.
Tom, I don't know if Tom's there.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to follow up on Gustavo's point and some of the other comments that were made, particularly about what Neus talked about, thinking about the political discourse here and the presence of the death drive or violence politically within the moment of the pandemic. Because I think it's important for Western civilization. It's a type of confrontation with death that we have not had. Certainly in the United States, I know there are people here from parts of the world that see a lot more violence than we do. I would agree with the points made that part of the we could call it the neoliberal project would be to sort of manage death through risk management. You make a calculation of the risks and the benefits and determine how to act. That's very, very much part of the liberal programmatic. which I don't see as Darwinian as such, but almost more a kind of scientific version of the humanist project of trying to manage conflict, and if we can just talk it all out and everything will be fine. But if you look at some of the different national responses to this, we have on the one hand a country like New Zealand, where the leader took a very you could almost say a humble approach in the face of what they were dealing with, and instituted some recommendations which have led to the virus not developing there in the way it's done in so many other parts of the world. And then you look at the country like mine, the United States, where the leadership took an approach of omnipotence and narcissism in the face of the virus for a long, long time. And when you take the binary that Florencia put in a note of omnipotence and narcissism versus culture and civilization, you see that the omnipotence and the narcissism of the speech in the face of the pandemic led to the United States now being the most devastated country in the world with this. Absolutely, unquestionably, a function of speech of the leadership of this country. So it's an example where you can tie a political discourse of a leader directly to a certain phenomenon of death and destruction within a country. Mm. And within the United States, I mean, I could talk for a long time about this. It's perhaps only of interest to people who follow United States politics. You can go state by state and look at the governor and how the governor's discourse around what to do has a direct relationship with the amount of death within that particular state. The other point that I would make is it's very interesting to bring up Darwin here. I think Gustavo's correct. It's really Herbert Spencer that should get the blame for a lot of this, and not Charles Darwin, who really saw himself honestly as a biologist and a scientist. It was Spencer's work that took Darwin, I think, into the political and the social realm with all the impact that it's had. But it's interesting to evoke colonialism now, because in the United States, the interesting phenomenon is who bears the death in the United States from the coronavirus. In my state, Nebraska, it is Mexican and Southeast Asian immigrants working in the packing houses and in the communities around the packing houses that have the overwhelming burden of death and disease and destruction as a function of a social order. So we have a political order, a social order that creates a structure in society and allocates, as a virtue of that, a certain amount of death and destruction to how that is put together. And then finally, I would agree, I think that Roger is right to highlight the very interesting phenomenon of the people who you would say embrace the death drive. I mean, it's a funny, Florencia made the comment about is the death drive worked its way into our discourse? I would say in a way, yes. You could say the decline of the paternal imago and the symbolic has worked its way into our discourse in the discourse of certain political leaders globally. You could go through country by country and determine which one of them even still holds on to a shred of an ideal and which one of them has dropped the ideal completely, and trace the effect of the holding on to that ideal or not with how the disease progresses in those countries. And likewise, when you look at the phenomenon of the protesters in the United States, I don't know if this is true in other countries in the same way. You sense people whose discourse includes an almost embrace of the possibility of encountering death through that in the name of freedom. So, I mean, I think I just wanted to introduce this as a few notes as to what that how we would write that political discourse out in terms of this pandemic for to carry that discussion forward.
No simple answers, and very important, Thomas, to somehow highlight the concrete life or death effects of the potency of a discourse. We're also reading Lacan's Seminar 17 at the moment with our colleagues from the UK, and it's certainly not so clear that these concepts that we have are so potent to read what's happening. So part of this endeavor and this project is to come together, to discuss, to read, to be critical, and also to question to what extent our own discourse is being affected, and where does its potency lie. I thank you very much, Neus and Tom, for today, and everybody else who was here. It's been a pleasure, and looking forward to our next meeting on the 16th. Don't hesitate to send us an email if there's anything, in between. We'll try to respond. And thanks, Alasdair, for sending the link to that beautiful scene of the Greek movie. So, bon weekend.
Bye.